Hi everyone, my name is Jaclyn Gary. I'm a senior at Princeton Day School, and today I'll be talking to you about my research that I conducted on the effectiveness of operant conditioning on gray reef sharks. That's a mouthful. We'll unpack it. Okay, so in the summer of 2016, I had the honor to travel to Fiji to study sharks and observe and interact with them in their natural environment. I dove with a company called Banga Adventure Divers, and they work with the sharks and they feed them so that they can bring divers down with them so that the divers can interact with the sharks. And I also made a lot of connections with the dive masters. There's me being a goofball with one of the dive masters before a dive. So you might ask, like, why did you go to Fiji just to hang out with some sharks? So that's because ecotourism is really important to Fiji's economy. So shark-related ecotourism provides an economic incentive for the government to protect their shark populations. The benefits of protecting populations such as the bull shark far outweighs the benefits of catching and selling these sharks for shark fin soup. So some of the dangers that the sharks encounter, not only shark finning, which you might have all assumed, but also for long line fishing. So a lot of sharks get caught by bycatch or as bycatch, and also bottom trawling is very destructive to their habitat. So the Fijian government recognized this and then created the Shark Reef Marine Reserve, which is a marine protected area, and it allows the community there and the species there to repopulate and replenish. But in order for shark-related ecotourism to be safe and successful, you must first understand the behavior of these creatures that you'll be working so closely with. So you might think, when you first think of sharks, you might think of that iconic Jaws image with the big teeth and it wants to eat you. But sharks are actually very curious and smart. Captive shark experiments have shown that sharks are able to perform and remember small tasks as well as small mammals. And they're capable of associative learning and social learning. Social learning is when they observe the behaviors and results of those behaviors of other sharks and then copy that. So with this in mind, we can deduce that sharks are capable of learning and are able to be conditioned by humans. So the Banga Adventure Divers decided that operant conditioning would probably produce the most successful results for their purposes. So operant conditioning, the goal is to have the subject perform a target behavior in response to a certain stimulus. They do this through, it's a behavior modifying process, and they use positive and negative reinforcement. Operant conditioning was first proven successful in sharks by Eugenie Clark and her colleagues in the late 1950s. So in this particular case, the target behavior was for the gray reef shark to approach the feeder from the right side. Yes. Okay, moving on. So my methodology, the data were collected over 4 dives in July of 2016. The data were categorized into 3 different groups. Successful feeding attempts, so when they approached the feeder and they received a piece of tuna. Unsuccessful feeding attempts, where they approached the diver from maybe the wrong side and got a poke from their little metal stick that they use to poke the sharks with. It's not harmful at all, it's just like a little poke in the nose and they swim away. And then feeding attempts that resulted in neither a food nor a poke. And then after this, the relationship between the number of pokes and the number of successful feeding attempts over the total number of attempts was analyzed using a correlation. So my results, this figure shows the percentages of attempts, of successful attempts, failed attempts, and neutral attempts over the entire number of attempts. And we observed that the success rate of the gray reef shark varied by day, but on average they were more successful than they were unsuccessful. So this is another figure that shows the amount of successful and unsuccessful and neutral feeding attempts over the 4 days. So the successful feeding attempts ranged from 5 to 30, whereas the unsuccessful was in the 10 to 12 range. So in conclusion, there was an average of 17 successful feeding attempts per dive and an average of 12 pokes per dive. And the average number of feeding attempts overall was 40, on average 40. And the overall feeding success rate of the gray reef shark was 40%, whereas the average percentage of attempts eliciting a poke was 30%. So this proved the hypothesis that operant conditioning methods are successful and are effective on gray reef sharks in the Shark Reef Marine Reserve. As I said before, on average, the shark performed the correct behavior more often than not. And this proves that the gray reef sharks in the Shark Reef Marine Reserve have generally learned. And this also suggests that these animals are capable of learning and remembering specific situations. And if further studies were to be performed, obviously 4 days is not a lot of time to collect data. So ideally, the research would be conducted over a longer period of time. And the success of this study proves that gray reef sharks have the capability to learn and that these methods can be implemented on perhaps other species or in other marine protected areas to bring revenue to those local economies. So this experience, this is me, it's a little mama bull shark right there. This experience solidified my aspirations to become a wildlife conservationist. And this experience was just, I'm sure you can imagine, just incredibly inspiring and amazing, because I was interacting with these megafauna that have been kind of vilified in the media, and they were right there in front of me. And it was also very interesting because a lot of times interacting with large animals is associated with bravery, strength, masculinity. And so for me to be there and watching and observing these animals as a female was really empowering for me. And it was also interesting because I had like a great rapport with the dive masters that I was working with, but as a rule they don't employ women at Benga Adventure Divers, because obviously Fiji's culture and their idea of gender roles is very different from ours. But it was interesting just to be, the students I was with and I are experienced divers, but I still couldn't be employed here just because of my gender. But however, interacting with these creatures was just an incredible experience and has solidified my hopes of becoming a wildlife conservationist, and it has allowed me to grow as a leader, as a diver, as an activist. Thank you.